1997, globalization mania and neoliberalism was reaching a high crest. President Bill Clinton put it this way: "The global economy is giving more of our own people and billions around the world the chance to work and live and raise their families with dignity. The American people have made our passage into the global information age and era of great American renewal." One thinker pushed back and in 1997 published a book with the title, "Has Globalization Gone Too Far?" His name was Dani Rodrik, and he went on to foresee that globalization without limits, what he called hyperglobalization, would fail to bring its promised benefits and would breed a powerful political backlash in the United States and Europe. He foresaw that globalization without limits meant that American workers were pitted in impossible competition against workers around the globe who earned a few dollars a day rather than $20 and $30 an hour. He foresaw that many American workers, with their pay cut, their future bleak, their kids looking forward to more of the same, and despised by the thriving, college-educated new elites, these workers would rebel against the political establishment and elect a spokesperson, a tribune who would voice their rage. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, Rodrik was largely a lonely voice, dissenting from the voices of globalization and its supporting theory, neoliberalism, which dominated the media and both political parties. But a change was coming. I first met Rodrik in the winter of 2016, shortly after Donald Trump's astonishing election to the presidency. When I walked into his office at the Kennedy School at Harvard, he was on the phone with a journalist who was seeking some words of wisdom, perhaps some consolation, to explain how a guy like Trump possibly could have succeeded. Suddenly, Dani Rodrik was sought after. Today, Dani Rodrik is professor of international political economy at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government and is president of the International Economic Association. Dani Rodrik, welcome to The Political Conversation.
Thank you, Wally. Nice to be with you.
Let's turn to your ideas about the failures of neoliberalism and what kind of paradigm could now begin to emerge, what you call productivism, and in the course of that, contrast the outlooks of the two paradigms.
I think what has come to be called neoliberalism, or sometimes, I call it market fundamentalism, is the view that is, first of all, we need to understand where it came from, because every paradigm is, in large sense, it gains credence because of the failures of the paradigm that preceded it. So it's important to understand where neoliberalism came from. It came from the apparent failures of the Keynesian welfare state arrangements by the 1970s. That this was a period of high inflation. This was a period when the standard Keynesian macroeconomic policies didn't seem to have a solution to the problems of wage cost spiral of the late 1970s, where the state seemed to be overexpanded and sort of the private sector seemed to be sort of losing its vitality. So there was a kind of a sort of neoliberalism with its central message that you have to liberalize and let the market do its job and stabilize, get the state and the taxes low, and then globalize, let the global economy integrate into the global economy so it can take advantage of the global division of labor, and privatize and get rid of these public enterprises. So that, seemed to offer a message that could produce a better outcome. And I think the basic problem with these sort of succession of paradigms is that, the pendulum swings from one extreme to another. So one dimension of this is the balance between the market and the state. I think all economic history, including economic theory, teaches us that, markets require states and states cannot prosper without healthy markets. So there's a complementarity between markets and states. That economies perform well when there is a good balance between markets and states, never when, you give markets too much power or you give the state too much power. And I worry that this sort of movement, historically has been always that we tend to overshoot. So if mercantilism and in some respects the Keynesian welfare state gave the state too much of a role, we had probably too many public enterprises. We were probably too ambitious in terms of macro-managing and micromanaging our economy. Tax rates were probably too high at the margin in a lot of different settings. By the same token, I think when we got to sort of neoliberalism, we forgot the important stabilizing role and equalizing role that the state could play. So, I think when I discuss productivism as, potentially the next paradigm, I'm hoping that we're able to achieve two things. One is that we have a better and a more enduring balance between markets and the state. Understand this complementarity, that it's not market or the state, it's market and the state. But that this is not simply at the national level or the federal level. A lot of this cooperation between firms and employers and private investors and collective organizations, whether it is local governments or local civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations. A lot of that has to happen at the local level. So number one is getting a better balance. And number two is sort of avoiding this pitfall of becoming a kind of a cookie cutter blueprint that resorts to easy generalizations and therefore very quickly loses its relevance to actual context. So being able to apply and think about these principles in a way that's very sensitive to local context and the needs of the moment. So that's the hard thing. And it's not clear to me that you can have a paradigm which is sufficiently flexible, because if you tell people, well, you have to do a lot of the thinking yourself, a lot of the ideas have to be developed on the ground, a lot of it has to rely on local experimentation. Well, people will, but you're not telling us what to do. You're just telling us nothing. And so I think there's a danger here. And that's why I'm myself of two minds, whether I want to push a paradigm or not. I mean, I want to push for a certain way of doing things. But if that goes too far into being overly prescriptive about what these experiments or what these local collaborations in creating good jobs, in creating local investments might look like, then we're going to replicate the errors of the past. I think the first most important challenge we face is the threat to our physical environment. That is, of course, the climate change challenge, the climate transition. This, I think, even the most orthodox and conservative economist understands is not a problem that can be left to markets alone. And that's going to require public policies. And we understand that these public policies now go significantly beyond simply raising the price of carbon, that is, the carbon taxation. I think most economists now understand that it is obviously desirable to raise the price of carbon so that consumers, pay the full social price of emitting carbon into the atmosphere. But that you need to complement that with significant public investments in new technologies, in green technologies. And that's essentially sort of the kind of step that the new Inflation Reduction Act of President Biden has started. But the big part of it is public investment to address climate change. The second existential challenge, I think, that we face is the one to our social environment, to our social fabric, and that's the challenge of creating good jobs. Creating an employment structure that gives people at the low end of the wage and skill and education distribution a way into the middle class. And that also is a problem that markets left on their own cannot solve, because essentially we now have had 40, 50 years of technological change and globalization that has hollowed out the middle class, that has created too few good jobs for people. And the middle class has collapsed globally within countries, most notably in the United States, where the protections and the role of the state has been weakest. So I think we need a set of concerted policies, partly based on training, but that goes beyond training. Policies towards firms, policies that in the old time used to be called industrial policies. But strategies of working with innovators and with investors and with producers focused on creating good jobs for the less advantageous members of the labor force. And that, again, is an area where I think this productivist set of ideas can make a contribution to. So, if we think about the climate change challenge and the good jobs challenges in some ways are most important short to medium term challenges. Both of them require, I think, going significantly beyond just sort of decentralized private initiative and markets.
I just read your second piece, sort of a follow-up piece you had one piece that introduced your productivism idea, and then you almost immediately produced another piece on fleshing it out and responding. And I read it, and it appeared to me to be a fairly direct response to some of the programs that Biden has succeeded in initiating and getting through. Your art, and allow me to distill it, your article urged that we not be fixated on competition with China and use that as a talisman for what we're doing, that we not focus on manufacturing and move into the services area, and the point you just made that in general we need to think that technology can do things other than enhance the ability of college graduates to earn even more money. It can help other people. It sounded to me like a fairly direct response to the Competition Act with China, the chips manufacturing bill, which is, again, China and manufacturing. I'm not asking you whether you meant it as a direct response to what everyone sees as a political success for the president, but it certainly sounded to me like your thoughts are that these ideas need to be injected into the political dialogue. Someone needs to be asking these questions at the political level. What about workers who don't have college degrees? What about the fact that manufacturing simply doesn't have the number of jobs it needed before? What about? How would you characterize it?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think these new programs and the CHIPS Act and the sort of public investments in green technologies and so forth, those are partly the background against which I'm talking about the emergence of a new paradigm. Because what's notable about these efforts is not that Democrats are once again willing to think about these public initiatives. So they're moving away from where the party was under Clinton, let's say. But it's that they're able to pass these bills because there are enough Republicans that want to be on board. So that there is also convergence from the right on some of these ideas. So I was writing, my first piece was really a kind of to say that, look, whether you like it or not, and whether I approve it or not, there is something brewing out there that's connecting, both sides of the political spectrum around a set of issues. And here are sort of what's together. It's much more focused on jobs, it's on community development, it's much less focused on globalization, it's more concerned about the health of local economies, it understands the role public capacity in the states. It's tends to be more skeptical about the role of large corporations and so forth. But also, I was a bit concerned. I mean, my caveat to all of this, it's a large footnote, if you will, maybe it's should be part of the main text, is that I see these efforts as being overly optimistic in terms of how many birds can be killed with one stone. So I think there is the sense that you can do the climate transition and you can fight sort of China on the geopolitical front and create a a good jobs economy all through the same kinds of tools. And I'm concerned that is not the case, that in particular, that the kinds of industrial policy that you might embark on in reaction to China, focused on manufacturing innovation, focused on semiconductors, focused on exports, is not where the jobs are going to be created. These are some of the least labor-intensive sectors of the economy, particularly for the kind of workers that we really want to do the most for. And so I'm concerned that if we don't have industrial policies or public institutions or technology programs that are specifically targeting a good jobs economy and what's happening in left behind regions and distressed parts of the economy, that we are going to be disappointed. And so I think that's the point that I want to make, that we need different types of industrial policy. We do need different types of technology and innovation programs. We need to focus much more on services. We need to focus much less on China. We need to focus much less on top-down programs and much more on local collaborative efforts, because that's really what's going to pay off. If you're thinking about how do I shore up my middle class and bring some of the social and political our society back together.
So here's an idea that I have I've been looking forward to discussing this with you, because I think quite frankly, I think the kind of work you're doing, whether anyone agrees with every single thing you are talking about or not, is exactly what the country needs to do. We need to be debating these ideas. We need to be wrestling with these ideas. And that's the most important contribution I think you and other folks are making. But here's the big question. You see these ideas as a bridge between the left and the right. They're both talking about business. They're talking about good businesses. They're talking about good jobs. And so it seems that there could be a bridge between left and right. But I worry that from a political point of view, the politics could work against you for obvious reasons. And I've been curious to hear what your reaction would be to this question. On the right, it's easy to see your ideas as rejected because it's just too big. It's too much government involvement. It's so easy to fall back on conservative cliches about the dangers of that. On the left, your ideas can be seen as too overtly interested in the middle class. We should be concerned about woke issues. We should be concerned about the poor. If you'll indulge me in another personal anecdote, I was in the state legislature for a number of years as a liberal Democrat, but a liberal Democrat who urged the party to have a middle-class agenda. And I vividly remember being screamed at by a prominent Democratic leader that was completely wrong, and that the Democratic Party should be concerned with the poor and if you'll pardon my language, the effing middle class can take care of its effing self. And it was, that was a very common outlook. So the danger of being the bridge between the left and the right is that you can be neither accepted by the left or the right.
Well, that's always a possibility, and that's why I'm not in politics, I'm very happy to say. But I think this is a war of ideas, and I think and there are ways of presenting the case that might appeal to important segments of both the right and the left. I think the important thing is for the Democrats to understand that as much as the U.S. system of safety nets and social protection and social programs, as much as they can be bolstered, the U.S. falls far short of what the standards of a welfare state, by the standards of the Western Europe, for example, would look like. As much as we have work to do there in terms of providing for better safety nets, and where we're really lacking is in terms of thinking about, again, productivist policies, which is not simply transfer income to people and provide for better social insurance, but actually create meaningful job opportunities, productive job opportunities for people. Because ultimately, that's how you address poverty, is by creating job ladders, productive paths for people out of poverty, not by simply more transfers and more social policies. So I think that's something that the progressives and the Democratic Party has to understand, that this is a critically important path forward. That as we move away from the traditional Keynesian welfare state arrangements of the past, that we need to move much more in the direction of working on the production, investment, innovation side of the picture, so that we're creating these paths of productive transformation from poverty into the middle class. And so, no, I don't care particularly about the middle class either, except in the sense that if we don't take care of the middle class, then we're not creating positions, paths into the middle class for the people at the very bottom, for the poor, right? So that's the thing. We want people in the bottom to be able to have paths into the middle class. And if we're not taking care of the middle class, that's not going to happen, because the middle class will shrink, just as a mathematical impossibility. For the right, I think, I would appeal to their sort of, simple political interest of being electability, right? I mean, it's responding to the economic and social needs of their communities. And that's going to require them being much more proactive and thinking in terms of collective action and the role of the public sector in what it can do. Several years ago, the journalist James Fallows and his wife went around the country in a single-engine plane, studying these kinds of local, collaborative arrangements to revitalize communities and so forth. And he was struck by how it didn't matter whether the local government was run by the Republicans or was run by the Democrats. When you're facing a common problem, which is joblessness or disappearing jobs or the factories moving away, as practical, women and men, you're drawn into a set of strategies of saying, how can you sort of, create better jobs and pull the community back together? And those kinds of pragmatic, practical strategies don't necessarily, come with a kind of a political affiliation of whether it's right wing or left wing, it's Republican versus Democrat. So I think there's a path that might connect both sides of the spectrum. On the other hand, I mean, I don't want to be Pollyannish. I mean, it's much of the Republican Party right now is someplace where I don't know exactly how to describe it. It's crazy.
If you find the words and tell the rest of us, please.
Yeah. So I'm totally cognizant of the fact that for much of the Republican Party, anything sort of reasonably sensible along the lines that I'm describing is a jump too far.
Yes, but there's so much in the traditional conservative, business-oriented Republican Party that might prick up its ears. They'd listen.
We're living in an era where some of the best arguments for new industrial policy are being made by Marco Rubio.
Or people like Oren Cass.
Yes.
So it's interesting to see that develop. Thanks for coming on the political conversation, and I look forward to wrestling with your ideas as they develop and as they enter the public mainstream and generate debate.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you.